Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and what I want to do, it's the end of 2019, and I want to talk about sort of 5 web development trends that you should be looking out for. Okay, the first one is going to be static site generators. This was a trend going into 2019 as well, but it's continuing to be a trend, and a lot of the technologies in this space are just getting better. Now, what is this trend? What is a static site generator? Because there's all this buzz around it. When you hear static site, it just means that there's no dynamic content, in the sense that while you're on the website, there isn't necessarily an API call to get data to render to the page. There's no pre-rendering of the website on the server per se. They're just delivering you HTML and CSS that's all set, ready to go, which means the website loads quicker and there's very little security issues because there's no input output. It's just read this. And people are thinking, well, isn't that going back to the way we used to do things when we used to just do HTML, CSS? Kind of and kind of not. What's happening is you have a suite of different frameworks and software and generators, such as Gatsby, Hugo, Jekyll, that have become all the rage. Because what they do is they allow you to have all that dynamic content and dynamic stuff that you would normally have with, let's say, WordPress, where you can have all, you have your database, and you can store all your blogs in your database, and you have all these plugins, and you're able to show your user all this data, but every time they go to a page, WordPress is rendering the page on your server, which just takes extra time, and if you're running a lot of plugins, it can end up making your WordPress site kind of slow. So wouldn't it be nice to have a fast blog, especially if it's just a blog? Okay, so what a lot of these will do is, instead of having a database, they'll use Markdown files. So if you're a web developer or you've used GitHub, you're probably familiar with Markdown files for like READMEs. And what it would do, it'll read these Markdown files. So every time you make a post, you would just make this Markdown file, and then when you would hit generate on the generator, and it'll read all your Markdown files, generate your blog based on a template that you design, or a template that someone else designed, and then generate the site for you just to go push up to your host. So in that case, all the generating of your website is done before you even deploy it. But it's not like the old days where, like, if you did something like that, every time I write a blog post, I have to go edit the site and type in the whole blog post right into the site, and then go move the other blog post off the page. It's more dynamic. It gives you that dynamic blog feel, but with a static result, which again is faster and more secure. And then, so again, Gatsby, Hugo, Jekyll, and many others are the big names in the space. And that's all good, but let's say one of the nice things about WordPress is that when you create a WordPress install for one of your clients, they have this nice GUI they can log into in the back to go make a new blog post or something like that. But Netlify, a really awesome host, has created what's called Netlify CMS. And this allows you to create a backend for your static site. So basically it allows you to generate those Markdown files right from your GitHub repo. And then basically you can set up the site through a static site generator for maybe for the local restaurant who's your client, and then they're going to want to be able to edit the content of the site. You hook up Netlify CMS, which creates this visual backend to edit those static files and generate them. So you'll still have the benefit of the static site, but with the benefits of a content management system, despite there being no database, so no need for the kind of server setup you would have with like a WordPress. So this is like a really cool for like that sort of, especially for that the type of client you would target with like WordPress. So your medium to small business, your freelancer, that kind of thing. But how about the trend number 2? How about those big sprawling applications, your Ubers, your Netflix, whatnot? For companies like that, well, that's where serverless comes in, because one of the big things when it comes to having big growing applications is you have to worry about scaling up. So that means, how do I make sure there's enough servers and we're balancing the load enough of our traffic so that way the user experience is smooth as all this traffic comes in. And then make sure that we have all this dynamic content, because again, you're choosing movies to stream, you are watching a car on a little map, and millions of people are doing it at the same time. How do you handle all that? You have to scale up your infrastructure. And what happens when suddenly a lot less people start doing it? Okay, well, I don't need as much infrastructure, so now I have all this extra infrastructure. That's a problem. That's scaling down. Okay, because you don't want to necessarily be paying for more infrastructure than you need. That's where serverless comes in. So this could be like Amazon Web Services, Azure for Microsoft, or Google Cloud, where basically a lot of these aspects of your infrastructure are abstracted away from you. So you don't have to worry about like, okay, I have a database, but do I have to worry about maintaining it, scaling it, and whatnot? No, AWS, Google, or Microsoft will do that for me. As far as like the servers that my websites run on, they'll scale it up and scale it down for me. I just need to worry about actually getting it in there and getting it set up. And once it's set up, it grows and it shrinks and I get billed for my usage. This is what's called the serverless architecture. Okay, versus like the static site generator thing with Netlify CMS that's oftentimes referred to as the jam stack. This is referred to as serverless. You're basically running without a server. I mean, there is a server, but you're not the one who's worried about it. Your stuff, your code's out there, whether it's running in small snippets through what's called like AWS Lambda, cloud functions, or if you're running a whole application on a little mini virtual server through like an EC2 or Google Cloud Compute. But more and more, as people who want to have huge applications that are planning to, that could possibly need to scale someday, this kind of architecture is going to become more and more popular. So understanding this stuff is going to be better. So if you're talking about that medium to small client, you know, that static site generator trend is going to be really important. If you're talking about like large enterprise clients and apps that are looking to grow to be the next big application, then serverless technology is going to be really important. Now, when it comes to the actual designing of websites on the front end, there's a couple trends to also look out there. So trend number 3 is WebAssembly. Okay, WebAssembly is not that old. It was only a few years old since it's been introduced in the browser. And the point of WebAssembly was for other languages to create compilers to compile to Wasm. So that way you could, use Python in the front end or use Rust in the front end. And the two languages that seem sort of closest to really having sort of implemented their Wasm compilers are Microsoft, who has a framework called Blazor. Right now, it's not so much that it translates your code to Wasm or to WebAssembly. What they did is they created a runtime in WebAssembly, so kind of like an interpreter box that runs in WebAssembly. That will runtime your .NET code. So that's the thing that exists. But eventually it's going to compile to Wasm, which will be even better. Rust is also working on their own compilers, and I think every language eventually will have their WebAssembly compiler. Because what's happened in the past is you would transpile the JavaScript, but it's a little bit less efficient, a little bit slower, okay? And then you still have JavaScript there. So every time JavaScript adds new features or whatnot, the transpilers always move slower than the language itself. But with Wasm, you can just give yourself all the features you want on the get-go. You don't have to necessarily wait for JavaScript per se. So I do think you're going to start seeing more and more languages that do that. And you're going to have a much more diverse option set for how do you do your front-end logic. Although I'd expect that JavaScript is still going to dominate, and I expect that TypeScript will keep growing because JavaScript will continue to dominate, TypeScript being a superset of JavaScript. So that's trend number 3. Pay attention to Wasm, which languages implement Wasm compilers, and people's use of actually doing sort of, and then where Wasm's going to be really useful is going to be applications that we're not even seeing yet, like think 3D gaming in the browser, things that are just generally impossible with current technologies, which is why we don't see them yet. Vue is going to be my 4th trend. I do think Vue's been growing, and it's really kind of growing to a sizable chunk that I do think in this year you're going to see it sort of occupy a much closer and similar scope of market share versus Angular and React. So while Vue is a strong 3rd, I think it will be competing for 2nd within the next year, and who knows what beyond that. Although in the long run, maybe this 5th trend is going to maybe like the next year, 2 or 3, I would keep an eye on Stencil and Svelte. These are compilers. They compile to web standard code. So Svelte is a framework for creating a web application, but unlike React, Vue, and Angular, you're going to compile the code into web standard code at the end. Same thing with Stencil. When you're done with your component or done with your application, you compile it to web standard code. And that's fast in a lot of ways because basically it's already working with code that the browser kind of understands from the get-go. The other cool thing about it is that since you just compile it as the underlying code changes, so let's say the underlying JavaScript changes, the compiler will you just recompile your code, and it now matches up to the new standards. Well, versus like if you're using React, Angular, or Vue, they change their specs. You have to go refactor your code to kind of meet their new specs to get the full advantages of those frameworks. So while there might still be new like syntax and whatnot in these compilers, it's a sort of a different value proposition. So I do think that's going to become more of a thing, because one, if you take a look at Svelte, Svelte is really easy to learn. Okay, Svelte has a workflow that's very similar to Vue, where in the sense that you have your styles, your application logic, and your template all in one file. Okay, so it's going to be very similar to Vue in that regard, but a lot of the syntax is actually a lot simpler. I was actually shocked by how simple some of the syntax was, where I didn't have to worry about, this kind of setup, that kind of setup. You just do it. Stencil has a workflow. It's kind of a mix of React and Angular. So in the sense that it uses a lot of the decorators similar to Angular, and then it's file structures similar to Angular in the sense where everything is separated. So everything has its own CSS file, its own JavaScript file. Actually, no, it's two files. So you have a CSS file, and then you have the JavaScript file. But you use JSX like JavaScript, like React. So basically, if you're used to developing in React, it's like React with only React classes. With only class functions or class components. So, which is pretty cool. Basically it's like class components without the things you don't like about class components. I don't think I've ever run into any issues with like this and having to worry about binding, because the decorators take care of a lot of that and take those considerations off. So you still get the class wrapper without the problems that were solved in React with hooks. So those are the trends. Those are the kind of technologies I'm going to be keeping an eye on and looking at and looking for their growth. So I'm expecting things like the static site generators to be growing, especially with Netlify CMS as a pairing. I expect serverless technology to be growing in a big way. So look into the serverless framework that makes working with serverless technologies really easy. Wasm, so take a look at Rust and Blazor from Microsoft. As far as how that goes, Vue, just keep an eye on Vue's growth. And Svelte and Stencil in the long run, I think those two have a promise as more projects start adopting and using them. So keep an eye on those things. I'll see you guys in 2020. It's going to be a great year, and enjoy.